It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind most people wish would last forever. The air outside carried a soft chill, and sunlight poured gently through the clouds. In a small suburban neighborhood just outside Arlington, a woman named Angela was getting ready to run a few errands before heading back to base the next day. Angela had served in the Army for more than 20 years. She wasn't the kind of person who liked attention. She liked her routine, her discipline, and her peace. She believed in structure but also kindness. She had seen enough of the world to know that both were needed to survive it. Her gray streaks of hair were a quiet symbol of experience, and her steady eyes held calm, the kind that comes only from years of training and life lessons. That morning, she made herself a simple breakfast, just eggs and toast. The news was on in the background, low enough not to fill the room but loud enough for her to catch the updates. She didn't pay much attention, though. Her mind was on the grocery list sitting on the kitchen counter. She wanted to grab a few essentials for the week ahead: some vegetables, bottled water, a loaf of bread, and dog food for her German Shepherd, Rocky. Before leaving, Angela slipped into a light jacket, one that happened to have a small military emblem stitched on the sleeve. She didn't wear her full uniform often when she was off duty, but she didn't hide who she was either. She was proud of her service, proud of the country she had helped protect, and proud of the discipline it gave her. When she stepped outside, the neighborhood was still. A few cars passed here and there. A man walked his dog, and two kids on bicycles waved as they sped by. She waved back, smiled, and unlocked her car, a dark blue sedan that had seen better days but still ran like a dream. The drive to the supermarket was short, maybe 10 minutes. Angela liked that grocery store because it was never too crowded on Sundays. She often went early before most families rolled in. The morning air and empty aisles gave her time to think and relax. As she drove, she hummed to a song playing on the radio, one from the 90s that reminded her of simpler times. She thought about her next assignment, her team, and the paperwork waiting on her desk. But she didn't mind. She always found satisfaction in work done well. When she reached the supermarket, she parked near the side entrance away from the main row of cars. It was a habit from years of being cautious. Less traffic meant fewer chances of a fender bender. She switched off the engine and reached for her list. Angela liked to plan her shopping before stepping inside. She took a few moments to review her list, marking off items she didn't really need and adding one or two she had forgotten. It was a small thing, but it made her feel organized. While she did that, she didn't notice a store employee walking by, glancing at her through the car window. From the outside, maybe it looked a bit unusual. Someone sitting in their car, writing something on a small pad, looking around occasionally. The employee, a young man who had just started working there, didn't mean any harm, but he had been told to report suspicious behavior if he ever saw something unusual. He hesitated, unsure, but eventually went back inside and quietly mentioned it to his supervisor. Angela was still in her car, scrolling through her phone to check a message from a friend, unaware that a misunderstanding was already beginning to take shape. Inside the store, the supervisor listened to the young employee and frowned. The town had seen a few car break-ins recently, and people were on edge. The supervisor decided to be cautious and called the non-emergency police line, reporting that a person in a parked car seems to be acting suspiciously. It wasn't an urgent call, just a routine check, and the employee didn't expect much to come of it. Back in the parking lot, Angela put her phone away and finally stepped out of the car. She stretched her arms, locked the doors, and started walking toward the entrance. She didn't notice the patrol car that had just pulled into the lot a few rows away. Officer Daniels had been on the job for several years. That morning he was restless, frustrated, and a bit on edge. He'd been called out earlier for a false alarm, and his mood hadn't improved. When he heard the call about a suspicious person near the supermarket, he decided to respond right away. To him, it sounded simple: just check and move on. But something about his attitude that day was off. He was the kind of person who liked control. He didn't like being questioned or challenged, and sometimes he let his emotions steer his actions instead of his training. As Daniels pulled up, Angela was opening her trunk to grab a reusable grocery bag. She saw the police car but didn't think much of it. Police vehicles often came and went in that area. She had great respect for law enforcement, having worked alongside many officers during her career. She knew how stressful their jobs could be. Daniels stepped out of the car, hand resting on his holster out of habit. He scanned the parking lot and spotted Angela near her car. He saw her jacket, the emblem on her sleeve, and the dark car she had come from. He made an assumption before saying a word. Angela looked up as he approached. "Good morning, officer," she said politely, her tone calm and friendly. "Ma'am, can I ask what you're doing here?" Daniel said, his voice clipped and slightly sharp. Angela blinked, a bit confused. "Just getting groceries," she replied. "Is something wrong?" "We got a call about someone acting suspiciously in a parked car. You wouldn't happen to know anything about that, would you?" Her eyebrows lifted slightly in surprise. "That must have been me, I suppose," she said with a faint smile. "I was just going over my shopping list before coming inside. Nothing unusual, I promise." Daniel studied her face, then her jacket. The sight of the military emblem seemed to irritate him for reasons even he couldn't explain. Maybe it was his pride, maybe bias, or maybe just his bad mood feeding his judgment. Angela noticed his stare but stayed composed. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked again, trying to keep her tone even. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked around the parking lot as if expecting to find something wrong. When he turned back to her, his tone was slightly softer. "You have identification on you, ma'am?" "Of course," she said, reaching for her small wallet in her pocket. She moved slowly, clearly making sure he could see her hands. She had dealt with tense situations before and knew how quickly misunderstandings could spiral. She handed over her ID card, which showed her name and her military rank. Daniels glanced at it, then back at her. Something in his expression shifted, though he tried not to show it. "All right," he muttered, handing it back. "Next time, maybe don't sit in your car so long. People get nervous." Angela smiled faintly, choosing not to take offense. "Understood," she said simply. He gave a short nod, then turned and walked back toward his car. Angela watched him go, still feeling a bit puzzled but unwilling to let the moment ruin her morning. She shook her head lightly and went into the supermarket, grabbing a cart near the door. Inside, the familiar sound of soft music and quiet chatter helped her relax again. She greeted the cashier she knew from previous visits and started down the first aisle. Within minutes, she was back in her routine, checking prices, picking vegetables, and comparing labels like anyone else. But outside, things hadn't settled entirely. Daniel stayed in his patrol car longer than usual, watching from a distance. He didn't write a report, but the moment had left something unsettled in both of them. For Angela, it was just a strange encounter, one she brushed off easily. But for Daniels, something about it gnawed at him. An uneasy mix of pride, resentment, and confusion he couldn't quite name. The rest of Angela's morning went by peacefully. She finished her shopping, loaded her bags into the car, and stopped by a nearby bakery for a cup of coffee. She sat by the window, sipping slowly and watching cars pass by. She didn't know it yet, but that brief, strange meeting in the parking lot was just the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would soon pull her into an unexpected storm. For now, though, she was just another customer enjoying a quiet Sunday morning, believing the day would end the same way it began, calm, ordinary, and safe. The afternoon sun was bright, and the parking lot shimmered slightly in the heat. Angela walked out of the supermarket with her bags balanced carefully in the cart. She felt relaxed again, almost forgetting the brief and strange conversation with the police officer earlier. She was the kind of person who believed in moving on quickly from unpleasant moments. She loaded her groceries into the trunk, double-checked her list to make sure she hadn't forgotten anything, and smiled to herself when she saw she'd even remembered the dog treats. Rocky would be pleased, she thought. She could already picture him wagging his tail as soon as she came through the door. That small thought lifted her mood. As she got ready to leave, she noticed a small crowd forming a few spaces away near the entrance. It looked like someone had accidentally locked their keys in their car. A few people were trying to help. Angela almost walked over to offer assistance but decided to stay out of it, since others already had it under control. She got into her car and sat quietly for a moment, turning the air conditioning on low while she checked her phone again. A few unread messages blinked on the screen, one from a colleague reminding her about a meeting later that week. Just as she was about to start the engine, she noticed movement in her rearview mirror. The same patrol car from earlier had returned. She frowned slightly but told herself it was probably a coincidence. Maybe the officer had other duties in the area. Still, something about it made her uneasy. She could sense that the situation might not be entirely over. Inside the patrol car, Officer Daniels sat in silence for a moment before stepping out. He had gone for a short drive around the block but found himself returning without really knowing why. Something about that brief interaction with Angela lingered in his mind. He told himself he just wanted to be sure everything was fine, but deep down there was something else, something harder to name. It wasn't logic guiding him now. It was emotion. Angela noticed him walking toward her again. She rolled down her window halfway and gave a polite nod. "Afternoon, officer," she said, her voice calm but cautious. Daniels hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Ma'am, I just wanted to double-check something," he said. "You said you were shopping earlier, right?" "Yes," Angela replied, a hint of confusion crossing her face. "I just finished." He looked into the back of her car, noticing the grocery bags and the receipt sitting on the dashboard. Everything looked normal. Still, his expression didn't soften. "Do you mind showing me that receipt, ma'am?" She blinked, surprised by the question. "Is there a problem?" "No problem, just routine," he said quickly. "We've had some reports about people using stolen credit cards in this area." Angela frowned but decided to stay patient. She reached for the small slip of paper on the dashboard and handed it to him. "Everything was paid in cash," she said simply. Daniels looked at the receipt, scanned it for a second, then handed it back. "All right," he muttered. He didn't apologize, but he also didn't say much else. There was an uncomfortable silence between them, and Angela could feel her patience wearing thin. "Officer, I don't mean to be rude," she said gently, "but I've been nothing but cooperative. I'd appreciate it if you could tell me exactly what's going on." Daniels looked away for a moment, then back at her.
He didn't have a real answer.
He just didn't like feeling questioned. Something about her calm authority bothered him. It made him feel like he wasn't in control of the situation anymore. "I'm just doing my job," he said, his tone firmer now. "You can go, ma'am." Angela nodded slowly. "All right then," she said. "You have a good day." She rolled the window up and started her car. Her hands were steady, but inside she felt a flicker of discomfort. She wasn't angry, not yet, just uneasy. She had learned over the years to recognize when someone's tone carried more than their words. This wasn't about safety or suspicion. It was something else. As she drove away, she couldn't help but glance in the mirror again. Daniels was still standing there, watching her car pull out of the parking lot. It sent a chill down her spine, though she couldn't explain why. She told herself not to overthink it and focused on the road ahead. Still, the thought lingered. Later that day, Angela stopped by a friend's house. Her friend worked as a nurse at a nearby hospital, and they often caught up over coffee when their schedules aligned. They sat in the living room talking about work, life, and small everyday things. At one point, Angela mentioned the strange encounter she'd had earlier at the store. She told it lightly, almost with a laugh, as if brushing off the discomfort. Her friend frowned. "That sounds odd," she said. "Did he have any reason to stop you again?" "Not that I could tell," Angela replied. "He said it was routine. I don't know. Maybe I just looked like I had too much free time in my car." She tried to make light of it again, but her friend wasn't convinced. Still, her friend said carefully, "Be cautious. You never know these days. Sometimes people in authority forget who they're talking to." Angela smiled softly and nodded. "You're right," she said. "But I'll be fine." That night, after she got home, she fed Rocky and sat out on the porch with a cup of tea. The neighborhood was peaceful, the sky turning from orange to deep blue as the sun disappeared. The air smelled faintly of cut grass, and crickets had begun their nightly rhythm. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling thankful for the calm. Then, from the corner of her eye, she noticed something across the street. A car parked farther than usual, lights dimmed. She squinted but couldn't make out who was inside. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was a neighbor's visitor. But the thought of that same patrol car came back to her, and for the first time she wondered if someone really had followed her. She shook off the thought, telling herself she was just being cautious. Still, she decided to make a quick note of the license plate on a pad near the door, just in case. Her years in the Army had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts whispered that something wasn't entirely right. The next morning came quietly. Angela woke up early as usual, went for a short run with Rocky, and returned to make breakfast. The sun peeked through the blinds, and for a while it felt like a normal day again. She checked her calendar and saw she had a meeting scheduled at the base later in the week. She looked forward to going back to work. It always grounded her. But even as she went about her day, that small moment of unease stayed at the back of her mind. She didn't know that the situation at the supermarket hadn't been forgotten by others either. The young employee who had first called about her had mentioned the incident to a few co-workers, and by the next day, half the store had heard different versions of the story. Some said the police found nothing wrong. Others whispered that there had been an incident involving a suspicious shopper. Stories have a way of changing as they spread. Meanwhile, Officer Daniels filled out a short report back at the station, vague and incomplete. He didn't mention her name or her rank, only that he had responded to a suspicious person and verified no crime had occurred. But something about the tone of his notes caught his supervisor's attention. The language was defensive, unnecessarily detailed for something so minor. It raised quiet questions, but not loud enough for anyone to act on. Angela, unaware of all this, went about her day with quiet determination. She believed in the good in people, and she hoped the incident was behind her, but the universe had other plans. Sometimes misunderstandings grow roots before anyone notices, and by the time they're seen clearly, they're already tangled too deep to pull out easily. For now, she simply carried on, calm, patient and unaware that the small misunderstanding from one simple grocery trip was about to become something far bigger than she could ever have imagined it. It had been a few days since Angela's last encounter at the supermarket. Life was moving along as usual. The mornings were filled with dog walks, emails, and brief moments of peace. But there was something in the back of her mind, like a faint shadow she couldn't quite shake off, a sense of unease that never fully disappeared. She wasn't sure what to make of the situation. Had the officer been just doing his job, as he claimed, or was there something more to it? Angela was the kind of person who always wanted to see the good in others, but this felt different. It didn't sit right. At work, things were busy. Angela was a senior officer in the military, and there was always something on her plate, meetings, reports, and decisions to make. But even as she focused on the tasks in front of her, her mind kept drifting back to the interaction with the officer. She couldn't help it. There was something nagging at her, an instinct telling her that she needed to stay alert. The thought of it would cross her mind when she was in a meeting, when she was having lunch, or when she was simply sitting quietly at her desk. It was as if a small, quiet voice was always whispering, "This isn't over." But she tried not to dwell on it. There were bigger things to focus on. The military had its own set of challenges, and she didn't have the luxury of getting distracted by what felt like a small issue. But the universe has a funny way of making sure things come full circle. One Thursday afternoon, a week after the supermarket encounter, Angela was in the middle of a training session with a group of younger officers. They were going over some standard procedures when the door opened, and in walked her commanding officer. "Angela," he called out, his voice serious. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" The group of officers exchanged glances, but Angela didn't miss a beat. She nodded and excused herself, stepping out of the room and into the hallway. Her commanding officer, a tall man with a commanding presence, was already pacing slightly, his brow furrowed as he spoke. "I just got some news that you might want to be aware of. There's been an incident involving you." Angela's heart skipped a beat. "An incident?" He nodded grimly. "It's been brought to my attention that a complaint was filed. Someone made an allegation that you were, involved in something inappropriate with a police officer last week." Angela froze. Her mind raced. "A complaint? Allegations?" She couldn't believe it. "Who filed this complaint?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. He glanced down at the papers in his hand. "It was an officer from the local police department. They said that you were somehow uncooperative or even disrespectful during your encounter. The details are vague, but it's serious enough to warrant an internal review." Angela's stomach churned. This wasn't happening. She had been nothing but calm and respectful during her interaction with that officer. She hadn't done anything wrong. "I don't understand," she said quietly. "I didn't do anything wrong." Her commanding officer met her eyes, and there was a brief moment of understanding between them. He knew Angela. He knew she was always professional, always did her job. "I know, Angela," he said softly, "but it doesn't always work that way. Complaints like these can escalate quickly, and even if the allegation is unfounded, we have to take it seriously. You're going to need to go through an internal investigation." Angela nodded, though her mind was still reeling. She couldn't believe this was happening. Later that evening, she found herself sitting at her kitchen table, staring at a blank page. She was supposed to write a statement, her side of the story, but the words didn't come easily. She had been so certain that the situation had been resolved. So why was it coming back to haunt her? The more she thought about it, the more it started to make sense. The officer, Daniels, had likely felt embarrassed or even threatened by her calm demeanor. Maybe he hadn't liked being questioned. Maybe he had felt like he had lost control of the situation and wanted to save face. But why would he file a complaint? What was his angle? The more Angela thought about it, the more frustrated she became. She didn't want to think the worst of anyone. But this wasn't just a misunderstanding anymore. It was something more complicated, and it was starting to affect her career. A few days later, Angela found herself sitting in a small, sterile conference room with her commanding officer and a few others from the internal review board. She had been asked to provide a statement about the incident, and she was determined to make sure they understood the truth. She explained everything carefully, how she had been polite and cooperative with Officer Daniels, how he had asked for her receipt and how she had handed it over without question. She told them about her unease, how she had noticed his discomfort when she asked him what was going on, and how the situation had ended with no further issues. Her commanding officer nodded as she spoke. He knew her well, and he could tell she was being truthful. But the members of the review board didn't seem as convinced. They asked her questions, probing her responses, looking for any inconsistency. Angela kept her cool, answering each question with precision. But inside, she could feel the frustration building. This wasn't just about her now. This was about everything she had worked for, her career, her reputation, everything. By the time the meeting ended, Angela felt drained. She was no closer to understanding what had happened or why it had all escalated. But one thing was clear. This wasn't going to be over anytime soon. As she left the conference room, her commanding officer pulled her aside. "You did well," he said. "I know this isn't easy, but we'll get to the bottom of it." Angela gave a stiff nod, but inside she felt a knot in her stomach. She wasn't sure how much more of this she could take. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. Angela tried to focus on her work, but her mind kept drifting back to the review. She couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, that someone was using her to settle some kind of score. But who and why? It wasn't until a week later, when a colleague mentioned a rumor, that Angela began to see the situation in a new light. The rumor was about Officer Daniels, how he had a history of making questionable decisions and how he had been involved in some previous incidents of misconduct. Angela's heart sank. Could it be? Was this officer someone who had a pattern of bad behavior? Had she unknowingly become the latest target in a series of wrongdoings? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but Angela knew she needed to be careful. She couldn't jump to conclusions, not without solid evidence, but the more she thought about it, the more she began to suspect that the officer had been using her as a scapegoat. She couldn't help but wonder what had happened to the justice she had spent so many years believing in. Was it really a matter of right and wrong? Or was everything just a matter of who had the most power? For the first time, Angela realized that she was in a battle that went far beyond a simple misunderstanding at a supermarket. She was up against something bigger, something more complicated, and she wasn't sure where it would lead. The days following the review board meeting were tense. Angela's mind was clouded with questions she didn't have answers to. Who was behind this? Why was she being dragged into a situation she hadn't even started? She found it hard to focus on anything else, but she kept pushing forward. There was always more work to do, more meetings, more decisions to make. The military had its own demands, and Angela was determined not to let her personal life interfere with her career. But the internal investigation loomed over her like a dark cloud, and the rumors about Officer Daniels were starting to surface more frequently. One morning, while she was on a break in the officers' lounge, she overheard a conversation between two colleagues. They were discussing how Daniels had been involved in several other incidents in the past, most of them involving excessive force or questionable actions during arrests. Angela's heart sank. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly starting to form, but they only created a bigger mystery. Why hadn't this information come out sooner? Why wasn't anyone doing something about it? The more Angela learned, the more she realized that Officer Daniels had been hiding behind a badge, using his position to manipulate situations in his favor. It was a tough pill to swallow. Angela had always believed in the system. in the idea that justice would prevail if you did things by the book. But now she was beginning to see cracks in that belief. It wasn't just about right and wrong anymore. It was about power, control, and the lengths some people would go to protect their reputation. The following week, Angela was called into a meeting with her commanding officer again. This time, however, it wasn't just about her statement or the internal investigation. It was about something more serious. The department had received new information about Officer Daniels, and the situation was about to take a different turn. "Angela," her commanding officer said, his voice more serious than usual, "we've been reviewing Officer Daniels' record, and there are some troubling things that have come up. We've received multiple reports of misconduct. There are witnesses who've come forward, and some of his past colleagues have spoken out about his behavior. It seems there's a pattern here." Angela felt a wave of relief wash over her, though it was tinged with sadness. She hadn't been imagining things. This officer had a history. It wasn't just her encounter that had been strange. It was a part of a much larger issue. "We're going to be moving forward with a full investigation into his actions," her commanding officer continued. "But we need your help. We need you to testify and provide everything you know about the situation. Your account could be crucial in making sure he's held accountable for what he's done." Angela nodded, her heart heavy. She had never wanted to be involved in something like this. She had always tried to stay out of drama, to focus on her work and do things the right way. But now she had no choice. She had to speak up, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever been affected by Officer Daniels' actions. The next few days were a whirlwind. Angela was called into meetings with legal teams, investigators, and even a few civilian advocates who had been following Daniels' case for years. Each person had a different perspective, but they all agreed on one thing. This officer had a history of abusing his position, and it needed to stop. Angela did her best to stay calm and focused, but the weight of the situation was heavy on her shoulders. She had always believed that the truth would come out in the end, that justice would always find its way to the surface. But the more she learned, the more she realized that things weren't always that simple. People with power could bend the rules, manipulate situations, and make the truth harder to find. On the day of the formal investigation, Angela arrived early, feeling both nervous and determined. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for anyone who had been hurt by Officer Daniels, anyone who had suffered in silence. She wanted to make sure that justice was served. The investigation lasted for hours. Angela provided her testimony, explaining everything she had experienced that day in the supermarket. She didn't hold back. She described the officer's behavior in detail, how she had felt uneasy, how the situation had escalated despite her calm demeanor. She also shared the information she had learned about Daniels' past, how he had a reputation for being aggressive, and how he had used his position to intimidate people. As the hours passed, Angela began to feel drained. She had never been part of something this intense before, and the pressure was starting to take its toll. But she knew she couldn't back down. She had to see it through to the end. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the investigation concluded. Angela was told that the case would be reviewed further, but there was hope that the truth would finally come to light. She left the building feeling a sense of both relief and uncertainty. It wasn't over yet. There was still a long road ahead. The weeks that followed were filled with tense anticipation. Angela continued with her work, trying to stay focused despite the looming uncertainty. She kept her head down, worked hard, and waited for any updates on the investigation. One day, a few weeks later, Angela received an email from her commanding officer. The subject line was simple: "Update on Officer Daniels." When she opened the email, her heart skipped a beat. The message was short and to the point. Officer Daniels had been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation into his actions. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. He wouldn't be able to harm anyone else while the investigation was ongoing, but Angela knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more steps to take, more hurdles to overcome. She wasn't naive enough to think that the process would be quick or easy, but she also knew that she had done the right thing. She had spoken out and she had helped expose the truth. As time went on, more people came forward with their own stories about Officer Daniels. It seemed like the tip of the iceberg had finally been uncovered. The investigation continued, and eventually the officer faced serious consequences for his actions. He was fired from his position and faced criminal charges for misconduct, abuse of power, and other offenses. It was a bittersweet outcome. While Angela was glad to see justice served, she couldn't help but think about all the people who had been affected by Daniels's actions over the years. There were so many victims whose stories hadn't been heard, whose pain had gone unnoticed. Angela, for her part, felt a sense of closure. She had been a small part of a much larger picture, but she had made a difference. She had stood up when it mattered, and she had helped bring someone to justice. She realized that sometimes the right thing isn't the easiest thing. It's not always about avoiding conflict or staying out of the way. Sometimes it's about facing difficult situations head-on and speaking the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. As she moved forward in her career, Angela knew that she would always carry this experience with her. It had taught her valuable lessons about justice, integrity, and the importance of speaking up. She would never forget the weight of that moment in the supermarket and how it had changed everything. But most of all, she would never forget the power of one voice to make a difference.